Good evening. Um, Wanted to come to you to talk about part three. Wait, no, can't quite get it there. Let's do this. Part three of the civil rights movement. Um, and the last part we're going to do now. Normally for this unit, I would do a whole bunch of different stuff, but we don't obviously have a normal class because here I am. But I just wanted to talk to you about what we're going to cover for part three and the fact that I want to have it done by Monday because next Thursday we're looking at a test. Thursday, Friday. Thursday would be maybe a review, Friday test. I don't know. But we need to get moving on because I want to talk a little bit about some other topics before the end of the school year, which is coming up in about a month. Although it feels weird because, it seems like we're already at the end of that school year because of this strange stay-at-home stuff. But yet we're still working. So it's crazy. But um, that's what we're going to do is finish up the unit with part three and move on to talk about Vietnam, some 1960s stuff, maybe even dabble a little bit 70s and 9/11. I usually get through 9/11 and talk about what happened, but who knows what we're going to see this year. But what I do want to get into is what we're going to talk about for part three in the civil rights movement. Okay, I don't know what happened here. Oh, there we go. And where we last left off, things look pretty good. I always call it kind of the high water mark for the civil rights era. There had been some pretty horrible violence against the movement, demonstrations and so on against Martin Luther King and police dogs and fire hoses and pretty brutal treatment. But things were really changing as far as laws and desegregation, buses being desegregated, interstate transport. Some cities, Birmingham, they actually won in Birmingham when they marched there in May, April, May of 1963. And even in June, early June of 1963, President John F. Kennedy came out and said, we must commit to a civil rights bill or legislation to help out African Americans in this country. That's a big deal. Now, we know, maybe we don't know, but John F. Kennedy was then assassinated just a few months later. But his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, used the memory of JFK and that momentum to push for a Civil Rights Act of 1964. Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation throughout the country. No longer legal. That's a big deal. Okay? That's a huge change. And so, but as that was going through and people were talking about what to do with that, it was sort of on the coattails of Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech, which I had you guys watch a clip of. That was in August of 1963. And after the victory in Birmingham, they planned to march on Washington. They really had some momentum. The nation was riveted by his speech because it was that good. And it seems like things are going well. But today we're going to talk about how the movement takes a bit of a turn away from nonviolence. And then part of that is a reaction to the way that they were treated. African Americans were treated horribly as they were protesting or peacefully demonstrating. They were brutalized. And so frustration starts to build. And we see that in a variety of ways. So we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. First thing, let's take a look at the goals for this section. List some of the changes made at the state and federal levels as a result of the civil rights movement. So what laws actually did change? There's a spot for you in the study guide that looks something like this. Okay, not this. Those are terms. It says, create a list of 5 instances when the federal government used its authority to intervene on behalf of the civil rights movement to force change in the South. So we're going to find that here in a minute and show you. Talk about it. The other thing we're going to look at is compare and contrast the ideas and practices of Malcolm X or the Black Power movement. We're going to skip that part. I should have just changed this to just Malcolm X, to those of Martin Luther King and the nonviolent movement. Normally we get into Black Power. It's offshoot, or it's very similar to Malcolm X. And we do a little activity with that, but it's hard to do a play in the classroom when we're not in the classroom. Okay, so we're just going to stick with Malcolm X and his beliefs versus Martin Luther King and his beliefs. Okay, so we'll get to that. This first video is not going to cover that. That'll be later. All right. But for now, let's take a look at some things that I want to talk about here in this unit. And I called this on the board, I said, or does it explode? Do you remember way back when I had this poem by Langston Hughes on the board? We're talking about the 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance, and I put this poem on the board, and I said Langston Hughes was kind of looking at what could happen to that dream deferred. And the dream deferred is the same as Martin Luther King's dream. Equality, freedom for African Americans. The inequality would end. And deferred means to be put off. So what happens when that dream of equality is deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? And the reason why I like this poem, I guess, when it comes to this part of the unit, is that we see that it does indeed explode. When people are getting fed up with the treatment and inequality, and laws might be changing on the books, on the national level, constitutional action is going on, and people are saying, yeah, it's finally changing, but behavior and treatment in the South and other parts just wasn't changing. African Americans are becoming frustrated, and there's some people that speak for that frustration, Malcolm X being one of them. We'll talk about that in a few. But I want to just kind of take a look at some of those things that leads into this part of the unit. Now remember, the Freedom Rides. They had seen horrible brutality, beaten at bus stops, firebombed outside of Anniston, Alabama, nearly killed. When the rights protest went to Birmingham, the police attacked them with fire hoses. Okay, sicked dogs on them. And it was this kind of action that started to lead to the frustration. Here's again another picture of the fire hoses over here. This was downtown. This was downtown. Bull Connor, the police commissioner, public safety commissioner, very safe, by the way, by attacking your citizens. But he had the police and the fire department attack the demonstrators. In this case, they were penned up against walls where they're being hit by 100 pounds per square inch of water pressure. It'd be like getting whacked with something heavy and trying to stand up as they're blasting you with it. It was brutal stuff. And the nation sees this and becomes more sympathetic to the cause, but to African Americans are saying, look, we're remaining nonviolent. We're trying to go here, be peaceful and demonstrate, and we're getting beat up. We're getting attacked. Some people said, well, it's for a just cause. We have to endure. Martin Luther King said we have to take it. Other people were starting to get frustrated and say, let's fight back. Let's do something. Okay? But as we saw at his March on Washington, very popular speech, he talks about, freedom and equality. Hundreds of thousands of people were there. Millions saw it on television. It makes an impact. And we start to see the impact in the form of laws. So here's where you could pause this video and write down some of these things. They're also in the notes that I'm going to post on Classroom, but that's not the point. The point is you can pause the video and write this stuff down. Here's a list of 5, at least there's many more than this, but here's 5 examples that I gave. In September of 1957, federal troops are sent to force the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. what we call the Little Rock Nine. They tried to integrate the high school and met stiff resistance from white citizens of Little Rock. So what did the president do eventually? He sends in the 101st Airborne to secure the school and uses that federal authority to say, you are going to let those 9 students attend that high school. Federal government stepping in. In September of 1962, James Meredith becomes the first African-American to enroll in the University of Mississippi and requires federal protection for that. In June of 1963, JFK federalizes the Alabama National Guard to enforce the integration of the University of Alabama. There's a scene in Forrest Gump where Forrest is going, what's going on? And the girl that was going into the school, an African-American girl, drops her book. And he's like, Miss, drop your book. And he gives her a book and then turns to the camera and walks away. That's what this scene is all about. It was the governor of Alabama that was speaking, and Forrest is looking behind him and trying to see what's going on. Okay. That was that situation, June of 1963. Okay. I didn't mark down here the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That would be an example of the federal government saying no more segregation, stepping in. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, where the barriers to the vote were struck down. Those are all things that help to bring equality, at least try. When I say bring equality, I said in the name of the law. There's equality in the name of the law. There's a difference between real equality and what the law says. Some would argue that, yes, there's laws on the books today that say there's equality, but there's really still not equality in our country. Okay? So just because there's laws doesn't mean that everything's fair and even. But those things did happen. Those that were passed. And this next slide shows you, again, I said the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right here. Big one. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Those are 2 big ones that happened in Martin Luther King's lifetime as results of things that he pushed for. Okay. The Voting Rights Act was another example, though. It passed after some pretty terrible stuff. So this first part we're talking about here is just setting up the difficult situation that occurs when nonviolent direct action, as we talked about last week, is intended to bring about change by confronting the situation. Martin Luther King said to foster tension, create a crisis so that the community can no longer ignore the problem, right? So you do marches, you do sit-ins, you do freedom rides, you do whatever, and it brings attention to the problem. It also brings a backlash, white backlash to the problem, where you have, as in the sit-ins, white demonstrators beating up the sit-in participants. You have in the freedom rides, white crowds meeting the freedom riders at bus stations and beating them severely. You have the police chief of Birmingham attacking children, basically. It was kids taken out of school. Many of the adults have been arrested, so they decided to take, teenagers out of school and have them march, and they were attacked by the police dogs and fire hoses. So you see this reaction to these demonstrations and people becoming violent against the nonviolent protesters. So even though you have laws changing, you still have problems. And that's beginning to frustrate a lot of Americans, African Americans. And that frustration is voiced in the form of riots. For example, the Watts riot in 1965 lasted 6 days, 34 died, and it caused over $40 million in property damage, as African Americans in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles rioted because of some police brutality during an arrest against an African American. Detroit, 1967, thousands of African Americans rioted and caused millions of dollars in property damage. 43 died. And even though things were changing, the president ordered a commission to study what was going on in society, and they realized that the nation was moving towards, as it says, quoting, 2 separate societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. So we're like, wait a minute. We just had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlaws segregation, Voting Rights Act. We see that there's There's desegregation all throughout the South. What's going on here? Well, even though laws were changing, people were not. And we can see that in this frustration. And a guy that seems to speak out for the frustration of the African Americans is named Malcolm X. There he is. Or not. There he was. Come here. Don't be shy. He's not known to be shy, by the way. Okay. You just can't get him to show up on my presentation. I don't want to go too far, or it goes to the back slide. Okay, there he is. Malcolm X. Malcolm X was not his born name. He was born Malcolm Little. And he had been a petty criminal and been in all sorts of things, prostitution. He was a pimp, which means he rented women out to people. He was into gambling illegally. He was into he gets arrested for running a burglary ring where he and his friend break into houses and steal all sorts of stuff. And he goes to prison. While in prison, he meets this man that teaches him about Elijah Muhammad, an Islamic leader from the United States, of this group called the Nation of Islam, sometimes referred to as the Black Muslims. And he changes his ways. And when he gets out of prison, he becomes a leading spokesperson for this group. Okay. Now, before I say too much, what I'm going to have you do in the study guide is part of your assignment is to read some of the excerpts right here from Malcolm X's message to the grassroots, one of his very famous speeches, and kind of take a look at his philosophy and answer the questions that go with it, like this one. Who does Malcolm X feel is the enemy of all black people? Okay. Then it goes down here and he says, what is the goal of revolution? How do you get it? Is Malcolm X for or against desegregation? How do you know? So I want you to read these in your study guide, these excerpts of his speech, and figure out the answers to these questions to kind of see a little bit of a difference between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. You watched Martin Luther King's speech. You've seen his commitment to nonviolence. You read, hopefully last week, the excerpts from his letter from a Birmingham jail that talked about how he was committed to nonviolence. So I want you to compare that or contrast that with what you see about Malcolm X. What does Malcolm X have to say? And so when you do that, I will come back. I'm going to talk to you about these questions, and then we're going to do this activity here together on here, where we talk about the comparisons, the contrasts between the two leaders. And then we're pretty much done. We're going to talk about then Martin Luther King's assassination, and we'll be done with this unit. But stay tuned. I'll post another video soon that has this activity. So, adios. I will see you shortly. Maybe.